In this episode of the Vintage Downhill podcast, we catch up with Alex Morgan of Buffalo Composite Designs. Alex has been designing, building, and racing full carbon, full suspension downhill bikes since the 1990s. Alex has innovated such things as multi-pivot carbon downhill bikes, gearbox downhill bikes, and the first 29er carbon downhill bike. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Alex Morgan. Alex Morgan, thank you for joining the Vintage Downhill podcast. We've been talking for a while. I remember the last time you and I talked about doing a podcast, it was raining and dark, so it must have been winter. I don't remember. And I was outside barbecuing, which I do all the time. But thank you for joining.
Quite a few months ago.
Yeah. So yeah, we had a hiccup in scheduling. I don't remember what happened, but we're here now. As you know, I run the Vintage Downhill page in the group and the podcast, and I created that just to kind of share the history of downhill and give people around the world a place to come together and chit chat and help each other build our dream bikes and talk about the history of downhill. And you are, in my opinion, a very unique figure in the world of downhill because you were creating carbon fiber full downhill bikes, carbon fiber 29er downhill bikes before even 29-inch wheels were accepted, let alone made out of like carbon. And you were doing gearbox, high pivot with, jockey pulleys, which are just now like in vogue. There's so many things you did that were so far ahead of their time. And not everybody knows about Buffalo Composite Designs, which was you and your brother's company. I believe you and Hawke were in partnership.
Yep, with BCD, sure were.
BCD what?
With BCD, Hawke did sort of his own stuff with hardtails and cross country racing and cyclocross bikes and seat posts, and then I used a lot of the molding processes to do stuff I was interested in, which was downhill.
Yeah. Okay. So I didn't realize that because I remember seeing a Softail looking bike, which maybe kind of reminds me of the Lahar carbon Softail, if you remember that one.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah,
I don't remember it having seat stays, right?
Let's see. I think if it was a Softail, it had seat stays, but they were like heavily curved.
Okay.
The lugs were painted, sort of off. We designed a bit off how Calfee makes bikes, where we these individual parts and make a custom geometry carbon frame without having all these big molds to do, like Trek was doing with monocoques at that time. And
I think Craig Calfee's still doing it the same old way.
Yeah.
And apparently you can still build a very light bike even with all those lugs.
Yeah, there's a look to it, and even some of the stuff that gets made now with like 3D printed titanium lugs on the downhill scene and carbon tubes has that look to it. It's an easy way to quickly prototype stuff, gluing carbon tubes to lugs, whether titanium or carbon. Also,
yeah, I mean Pivot, Atherton, and Specialized are all doing that right now.
Yeah.
Has a kind of a Geiger-esque look to it, which I kind of like. So. We were talking just before I hit record a little bit about, my perception of you and Buffalo Composite Designs being maybe something of a self-taught engineer, autodidact, building carbon machines basically out of your house. So are you a self-taught engineer? Like what spurred you to think you could create your own custom carbon fiber downhill bikes from your home? And how did you do that?
Yeah, not really engineer, just I've been riding since I was 13 and broke a few bikes, steel and aluminum, and I guess I didn't want to break any more bikes. So when I started making them out of carbon, I tend to overbuild stuff. Mm-hmm. It still ends up being a lot lighter. But no real engineer background, just a lot of sketches on paper and drawing, pre-CAD stuff and trying to visualize a 3D model in my head, on the functionality and the clearances and things like that.
Did you grow up like hands-on building stuff, helping your dad work on his car, that kind of thing?
Yeah. Did a little bit of that stuff, and then my dad built amusement park rides, mainly fun houses. And that's what sort of brought me into the composites. We did a lot of fiberglass layups with molds, just wet layup, so no compaction. But the
Okay.
process of making a composite was there. And that's sort of how me and my brother both got into it afterwards was we had this baseline of how to do composites. We just introduced epoxies and carbons instead of fiberglass and cheaper resins, and then got in compaction different ways to do compaction, whether it's autoclave vacuum bagging or just pressure with like a balsa wood core or bladder molded.
I told you earlier, I've done a little bit with carbon. I've repaired some of my downhill bikes with carbon. A buddy of mine, do you remember Alpha Q? They were making like road bike forks and components.
Yep.
So I'm up here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and Alpha Q started in San Leandro, which is right next door to Oakland. And that dude, Q Wong Lee, is an engineer from South Korea. And my buddy and I were working at a bike shop, and he picked up my buddy just because he was very impressed with his mechanical abilities. And my buddy ended up taking over all production for Alpha Q. And we were obviously both into bikes, but also remote control airplanes and constantly braking stuff. So I kept getting a supply of unidirectional pre-preg that I just keep in my freezer. And I still do during, to this day, because it's just like a good thing to have on hand.
Yeah, right.
But dude, I've repaired downhill bikes, carbon handlebars, remote control frames. I've built my own fork guards and stuff like this. So I'm not like to your level, but the compaction component can be one of the most difficult things. Like, if you have a wacky frame piece that maybe isn't tubular or whatever, and you strip it and you got a crack, you drill out the cracks and you wrap it in UD. I'll try to go like 45, 90, whatever. Then how do you compact it? And hopefully the thing is small enough to fit in your oven. The compaction piece can be the most difficult. So I was able to get some of the vacuum bag plastic, and I would use like twine and wrap it around the thing and put it in the oven, and then it would squeeze out all the glue, and I'd shave that off. And but the compaction itself can oftentimes be the most difficult aspect, even if you have, like in this case, we had like really high grade UD pre-preg.
Yeah, and the higher grade pre-preg, you got to have better compaction, or you're going to end up with voids. If you're doing wet layup and you have an extra amount of resin, we've done stuff simple as much as like wrapping with electrical tape, from center out. It squeezes out the excess resin. But you need some compaction, and the better you have, the more pressure to a point. I mean, you can't extract too much epoxy. There's a ratio there that's optimal.
Does electrical tape withstand the heat?
That was just wet layup, room temp cure stuff. I forget what we were even fixing or not fixing or what, but my brother does some epoxy repair or carbon repair down in Albuquerque occasionally.
I've only had UD pre-preg. I don't even think I've had weave, but it was always UD pre-preg, and so compaction was always, how do I achieve that? And
all our posts that we started with, composite wise, were all fabric, dry fabric, and epoxies bladder molded at room temperature.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So like back in the 90s, I think probably back as like 1994 or 1995, I remember seeing the Buffalo Composite Design seat post. It was a very organic looking seat post. Was that your first like actual retail product?
Yep. Monocoque, hollow.
Yeah.
And we build them for the rider's weight grading.
It was like 175 grams ish, wasn't it?
Yeah. It depends on the length, and it really like building stuff larger than, 27.2. It was a lot stronger as soon as you got bigger diameters with 30.9 and 31.6.
Yeah.
And then we even made some like triathlete posts that were forward facing. And my brother carved the plug out of wood, and it sort of looked like a seahorse head. So when we molded the plug, the carbon seat post was like this seahorse. So that sort of fit in with the triathlete type of, I don't know, aqua, whatever. And then one of our posts had a sunflower embedded in the mold, a profile of a sunflower.
Cool.
And So that was always fun to sort of like mess with a little bit design elements in the molding process through the plugs.
You have a few Easter eggs in some of your bikes. I mean, the one that comes to mind is I think it was your inedible.
Mm-hmm.
You use Chris King top caps for the main pivot, right? And I don't
Yeah,
know if most people like recognize that, but you talked about it somewhere sometime, and I have this, memory for quirky things. I'm like, oh yeah, that's cool.
yeah. I sort of talked to Chris early on about stuff and got one of his early Perdido, I think they called it, integrated headsets,
Mm-hmm.
and worked around that design on some of my earlier bikes. And then, yeah, whatever I had extra to purchase that I needed, something to hold the caps, to hold all the suspension components together and stuff, I'd sort of throw in a crisping flare here and there.
A little bit of bling.
Yeah. Or I've glued Lego men into the layups sometimes, or
Yeah.
even if you like take UD and cut it into like letters or things,
Mm.
and it acts as it's sort of like an embedded ghosted type of text
Uh-huh.
in your tubes. Uh, there's a composites guy, trying to say Leatherman, but he's up in Wisconsin. He does that. Appleman. He does some
Oh.
embed of like carbon text and design in his layups when he made bikes. I think he's more into cranks now. But
I hope my air conditioner isn't providing too much background. Okay. So, did you guys make your own tubes?
yes, yeah, and those were pre-preg
Okay.
our frames, and they were machined aluminum molds in halves that we
Mhm.
made ourselves at a local machine shop in Albuquerque.
Mhm.
Real generous guy, Ted, and he would train you on the machine and then rent it to you by the hour. So
Wow.
we rent Bridgeport mills and lathes and have all access to his machining tools. He's long. I don't know if he's even still alive, but without that, it would have been very difficult and costly to have like a nice aluminum prepreg mold.
Yeah.
We were able to make them pretty affordably at that machine shop.
Have you guys been out of New Mexico this whole time, or?
Early on, it was Amarillo. That's sort of where we grew up
Oh yeah. Okay.
and handled there, and then we moved to Santa Fe and also Albuquerque and back and forth
Mhm.
a few times. But the majority of the composites work was done in Albuquerque and Santa Fe.
So how did Buffalo Composite Design start?
Let's see. I think my brother wanted to build a bicycle first, actually before C-posts,
Hmm.
and he a whole plug out of wood that sort of looked like a single elevated chainstay kestrel looking monocoque. And
Hmm.
then we realized that we should start on something smaller. So we started building C-posts. And after 1991 Worlds, I went there as a junior. That was my last year. I took a year off, but then I was like, I want to get into downhill because
Hmm.
that's where well at 91 Worlds. I beat all of the national team members, uh, and I wasn't
Weren't you
selected.
like top 10 or top 13 or something?
I was 10th, yeah.
Yeah.
But it was funny. I didn't really like USA Cycling that much and didn't get selected for the team. And then I raged on them at the race and beat all the Americans.
Wasn't it like some kind of
But
technicality that they kept you from competing in that race?
no, that was 91. So I was on a Schwinn Paramount hardtail,
Oh,
like
okay.
a bike with an RS1.
Yeah.
Rock. Um, Later on, there was some threatening of technicality, but not any. So that was sort of the beginning. Was need of a bicycle. I wanted a downhill bike, and I couldn't really afford anything that was out there. So I took an old Schwinn hardtail and cut the back end of it off, and built a fiberglass hinge at the bottom bracket, like sort
Mhm.
of what slingshot bikes would have had. And then just built an elastomer up at the seat stay, just a mono.
Oh, okay. So like a leaf spring, a short leaf spring.
Yep. And
Yeah.
it had 1/2 inches of travel or something. And we molded our own elastomer. It was like this long for the rear suspension. And I built the plug out of clay and made it look like a 7-layer cheeseburger, and
Uh-huh.
then made the mold off of it. And we cast the elastomer into that mold. I then painted the elastomer to look like a cheeseburger, and that went down as the cheeseburger bike. But that was really our first bike, not composite, but first bike we'd made.
I mean, making your own composite bikes, just from your home or whatever is adventurous. I wouldn't even know where to start making my own elastomer. How do you even figure that out?
We made some that too soft, and some of them fell apart. But yeah, you just sort of start buying the right resins, and hopefully it expands out and it's the right durometer.
And this is like before the internet. So where are you going to the library? How are you even learning these technologies?
Turkey was a great location for it because Labs was there, and through that machine shop we'd rent from, we met a composites guy who worked in the aerospace industry,
Mm-hmm.
and we would hang out at his place and pick his brain, and I think Hawke and I both learned a lot from that man, and he was in Albuquerque.
Mm-hmm.
We always had him to sort of ask a few questions about, um, and sort of learn what's going on, and how to complete a project we might have.
Yeah. So originally, Hawk wanted to build a hardtail, and you ended up starting off or jumping off with the seat post. And then how did BCD progress from there? And was there a bit of a bifurcation between Hawk's interests and your interests? You already kind of talked about you were more into downhill, and it seemed he was maybe into road or triathlon
Yeah,
or cross country.
cyclocross and cross country. Yep. Yeah, he wanted to make a business that, like a profitable business, and I was more into just, playing around and making prototypes, and making all these designs that sort of come up in my head.
Mm-hmm.
So they ended up, my father and Hawke, and we had a few employees around. This one guy, Dave Salinas, he still lives in Albuquerque. He was our employee for a while,
Mm-hmm.
and they all together put out about, I think we did like 1,500 seat posts one year.
Wow.
So we had a little production going on there, and but I was more I'd help with that some, but I was more into, like, I want to make, a downhill bike, and go racing.
And this was still like early to mid 90s.
Yeah, I think the first, like, real downhill bike I made was just sort of look like what would have been Rocky Mountain pipeline type of thing, single chainstay, just a big fat chainstay with a shock on it. And I made that bike in 94, I think.
Like
And
a lowish pivot.
yeah, sort of like mid chain ring pivot.
Mhm.
Rear swing arm was really flexy because it was just all out there by itself, and it was wet layup, not pre-preg, so it wasn't that strong, and pre-through axles. But I had 5 inches of travel on the back of my bike, and
In
had
94 or 95?
yeah, 94.
Yeah.
So I had a good amount, and it was a light bike. I actually won a cross country race in Albuquerque at Sandia,
Mm.
like 2 days after I built it, and I was like, I'm going to ride my, what would be considered like an all mountain bike up at this hardtail cross country race, and won that. But I'd made the fork for it too. It was an interesting fork. I machined a crown that wasn't in line with the steer tube. It kicked the front legs out forward,
Mm-hmm.
and then the dropouts faced backwards.
Hmm.
So this was before people were like, hey, let's run slack head angles to get like increased impact angle for larger hits. So I still had like a 71-degree head angle, but the fork slider angle was set at like 66 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
So as the fork would get an impact, it would like if you have a wheel, a large impact comes to the front side of the circle.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this trajectory isn't 71 degrees or 90. it's more trying to absorb at a higher angle. And, you know, that's why downhill bikes have such slack head angles. It's because they're taking large impacts on the front side of these tires. So I sort of thought that, but I wanted to still steer well. So I kept the 71 and then angled the fork legs.
That reminds me of my cross-track Sonoma. Do you remember those?
Huh.
Yeah, like 1993, Crosstrack was building. I mean, my bike has 5 inches of travel on the back and then 4 in the front, air sprung, oil damped. They're made up here in Northern California. But
Okay.
it's what you described. It has a 71-degree head tube angle, but the fork, they made their own fork. It was canted out another 3 or 4 degrees. I'll show you a picture later, but yeah. I know what you're talking about.
Did they reverse the dropouts to correct the trail?
I would almost go grab it. I think the dropouts were in line.
In line.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was trying to make it still handle pretty well. So I flipped the dropouts around to get my fork rate close to where it needed to be.
Okay. So I understand now. So the bump forces were more in line with the fork legs, but you still preserved an effective 71-ish degree head tube angle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And make forks. I was lucky I didn't hurt myself on that fork.
And so what were the mechanics of the fork?
Oh my gosh. So, well, the crown was overbuilt like crazy because I didn't want to break that. But the actual fork legs were thin wall aluminum, probably like 6000 series. And then we rolled pre-preg up inside of it and used the aluminum basically as the mold. So it had an internal carbon reinforcement. Mm-hmm. But the sliders worked on the outside of the aluminum. And it had no brake arch. I had a large through axle, as large as I could find, to accept. I forget what it even was. So it wasn't inverted. It was just normal lowers, larger diameter lowers, but no brake arch. Mm-hmm. And an elastomer stack in between the two upper and lowers. Mm-hmm. And then odd that the elastomer stack rode on actually protruded out at the bottom of the dropout during compression. And it had a rebound elastomer on it. So when the rod up, it, you know, prevented the fork from coming apart.
That's actually kind of cool. You could kind of fine tune the negative spring without tearing the fork apart.
Could have, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, that's kind of like Manitou 1/2-ish, where the elastomer stack is between the lower and the upper, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the little push rod thing would be susceptible to snagging on debris or getting hit by a rock. And
yeah,
it was very rudimentary for a first fork, but I did have a lot of travel, and that's sort of all I cared about at the time.
Yeah, that's cool. So you made your own tubes, you made your own lugs, and I want to hear how you made your swing arms, because I think you did something there that a lot of people wouldn't think about.
Mm-hmm. This one that I was just talking about was called the Couch, and it was a bladder molded swing arm.
Okay.
But if enough. So I was like, I need unidirectional swing arm. So the next bikes I built after that, I built some simple molds out of aluminum plate and aluminum angle iron, and ended up with a void. Mm-hmm. And layer my pre-preg in this void. And then in the center of the pre-preg was ingrained balsa wood. Mm-hmm. From a hobby shop. So I would cut it for the wall thickness I wanted my swing arm to be. Mm-hmm. And get side compaction, I would ram oak wedges into balsa wood, which would push it sideways to get some compaction against sides of the mold. And then I'd C-clamp the whole thing together and just sandwich it. And you end up with a strong piece.
You've got balsa wood in the middle with oak spikes or nails to push it against the exterior mold.
Yeah, to split the balsa and like press it sideways. So they're they're wedges. They're an inch wide and sort of short, but you stab them through the balsa to like really create as much compaction as you could. Vertically was taken care of with a bunch of C-clamps, but then all that would go in this oven we had, where we blew out the back of it so we could put longer items in the oven. Uh-huh. That was this stinky old Kenmore oven that we found somewhere, electric one. And we just crank that thing up and let it smoke with like epoxy dripping out of the molds on the elements. And
Yeah.
yeah,
My wife loves when I cook carbon fiber pieces in our kitchen.
open the and the windows.
Yeah. Um,
We were banned in the garage.
yeah. No, I usually beg for forgiveness versus ask for permission, and so far so good.
She sees you coming now, though.
Yeah. Um, yeah, that was something that I read somewhere along the way that you actually had a balsa wood core, and I'm not sure I can think of anybody else who's building, carbon fiber anything with wooden cores.
No, I think some stuff may have used like a honeycomb, here and there, but not balsa wood. For me, it worked really well because these items were consistent wall thicknesses
Mm-hmm.
of the swing arms and things. So I wasn't trying to like create any crazy shapes that are really 2D looking, and they ended up looking like 2x4s. And that was one of my bicycles I named because it was just like this
Right.
carbon 2x4.
You know who actually does use a balsa wood core in a composite structure is Corvette.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Corvettes have used a composite leaf spring front and rear for the longest time.
Mm-hmm.
And it has a balsa wood core. I don't know if it does today, but it did up
Right.
until very recently.
Huh.
So, yeah, you're right up there with Taj Junctor.
Yeah. Well, maybe I heard that at some point in my life, and
Yeah,
I can apply that to something I'm doing.
yeah. So it's not unheard of. You're right up there with GM.
Yeah.
Um, so what was the first like bicycle frame that you guys actually put out on the market?
Um, I guess the first one I'd sold was a 2x4. I'd made, let's see, like 3 prototypes before that, just for personal use, different designs. A unified triangle bike and that couch bike, the first one. And I actually made an original 2x4 frame that had 2 shocks and 2 pivots, and each shock ran off its own pivot. But the lower pivot wasn't bottom bracket. It was sort of in front of the bottom bracket. It wasn't concentric.
Mm-hmm.
And that 2x4 didn't have a idler for the chain to go around. So it had a
Oh,
huge kickback. It was great coasting, but it was absolutely worthless, like a 1990 Cannondale to pedal. So, um,
so
so
this is where I'm going to ask you for a picture that I can overlay to help people understand. But let's see if we can try and describe the suspension dynamics and kinematics of this bike, because it's almost like you took a high pivot swing arm and a low pivot swing arm and put the two together.
that's
So
right. And neither one of them would work to by themselves. They needed each other for structural integrity. So we'll start with the high pivot. Was just a single swing arm that went to a high pivot and came down past the down tube, and then the shock was sort of under the down tube,
right.
and the other end of the shock actually went to what would be the vertical swing arm for the high pivot shock, and it's
So,
considered around the bottom bracket.
so the high pivot swing arm extended all the way past the down tube, and the shock was underneath the down tube.
Yes.
And that lower shock mount attached to the low pivot swing arm?
Yeah, the low pivot swing arm was 2 plates that were concentric on the bottom bracket that went up to the high pivot.
Right.
And at the top of those 2 plates was an eyelet for the shock that went to the down tube.
Uh,
So when you compressed the bottom bracket pivot, and it would compress the shock into the down tube, the entire rear swing arm and shock underneath the down tube would move together.
right.
Yeah. But
And
it could also work independently.
I think I remember you saying, from a magazine way back when, that you didn't have a defined axle path, that it moved within like an area,
Yes.
depending on whatever the shock forces were, depending on how whatever the bump pushed the wheel. Can you describe that?
Yeah, that goes back to talking about impact. So if you land vertically off a jump, you're hitting the bottom of your tire. And if your rear tire hits a large rock, it's doing a rear trajectory. So I want to have a shock that could handle both those loads as freely as possible. And that's how I came up with this design. So if you went through the complete travel on the low pivot, like bottom bracket pivot location, which would push the wheel straight up and around the bottom bracket, you got 2.5-3 inches of travel, I think. And that creates an arc on the rear wheel. And then if you were to go through the whole stroke on the swing arm that goes underneath the bottom bracket's high pivot, that creates a rear wheel trajectory arc. So you go through both motions and you end up creating this zone that's sort of shaped like this, an area the wheel can travel in. And because the chain went over a roller at the high pivot and it was concentric around the bottom bracket, there was zero pedal kickback.
Wow.
No matter what the rear wheel did during these movements.
So like around what time did you make that bike?
I wish I could remember super well. 03 maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you have
earlier than that? It was 98, I think, because my first one I think was 97.
I want to say it was 98.
Yeah, I think it was 98.
Did you have any tools or any help to design the kinematics, or was it just trial and error?
Leverage ratios and things I sort of learned on from my previous bikes. And this was another thing, is I wanted lower leverage ratios so my dampers would handle the loads better and the shock wouldn't get so it's hot. So I was like, nobody makes a rear shock that has 3.5 inches of travel. Well, Foes might have, a Kernet or something.
Yeah.
I don't even know if they existed at that time. But so I took 2 shocks and split the leverage loads between these 2 shocks. So I ended up with a total of it would have been 4 3/4 inches of travel shock stroke for this. So it was really easy to tune the suspension on this bike. But the kinematics and stuff, I just, sort of trial and error the first bikes. I knew what didn't work well, high leverage ratios, and had an air shock on one of my first bikes. So I wanted coil springs on this one. So I just sort of, it's simple leverage stuff on this. I wasn't trying to do VPP type stuff where you get all kinds of shock curves and falling rates and rising rates. And this is all just simple leverage stuff, which works really well if you have a shock that's not overloaded on its leverage.
Yeah. And having 2 shocks, I think, gives you some tuning capability that you wouldn't have with 1 shock.
Oh, yeah.
Back in 96, 97, I got a Kestrel Rubicon from Kurt Stockton.
Yep.
And he took one of his downhill bikes and built it for me as a cross-country bike.
Okay.
And after, a few months, I'm like, no, I'm going to make a downhill bike. So it had a Fox Alps 5 in the front, and then I had a Reese Jupiter made for the back. And so I kind of tuned it to where the Reese was small bump compliance, whereas the Fox, the air shock, which had more stiction, was your bottom out, your big bump, right? And so you can create kind of a synergy there. I don't know if you were able to do that with yours, but I think having 2 shocks gives you some tuning capabilities. You can tune for small and big hits, and that's still to this day the plushest bike I've ever ridden.
Yeah, and that probably had 3.5 or 4 inches of total shock stroke in it.
Not much. 2.5.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, each one of those shocks, they're very hard to come by. They were a 6-inch eye to eye by 1 1/4, which nobody makes that.
No, why would a 1-inch stroke shock?
Yeah, so it only had 2.5 inches of total stroke and 8 3/4 inches of travel. So it had a high leverage ratio.
Right, different use, but yeah, the tunability, you are right. Like my bottom of the shock hit BB pivot, I tuned really high compression and slow rebound. That's like a low amplitude, low speed compression because you're landing off something, you know, or hitting a G out. Whereas the high pivot was handling more of the chattery type stuff, like
Yeah.
high speed compression stuff. So it was set pretty fast.
You know, probably with newer shocks today, you can tune all that because like everybody's got high and low speed compression and rebound now. But back in the day,
Right. Yeah.
okay, so we understand how you made your own tubes, and I was a little bit surprised to hear that you did that because not even Craig Calfee makes his own tubes,
I
right?
know.
And
when you buy filament wound tubes for super cheap,
yeah,
but we wanted to do lugged, you know, tapered, you know, tubes with different wall thicknesses.
so your tubes were butted?
Yeah, we're butted.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Triple, and sometimes we, you know, really overbuild one end, like the head tube end of a downhill bike, down just because we didn't want it to break. I mean, seriously, the wall thickness was close to 3/16 thick, probably.
Wow.
So you're not really
Yeah.
a ton of weight in carbon, so you might as well put in a safety factor there.
And were you using UD or were you using weave or was it pre-preg or
UD, except for the external. We
Mhm.
used weave just so we had a conventional, you know, weave look to the carbon.
Mhm. Um, okay, so we know how you made your tubes. We know how you made your swing arms. How did you make your lugs?
Lugs, yeah. The head tube lug was an aluminum mandrel that we molded around vacuum, and it was actually made wet layup, dry
Okay.
fabric. And I would put leader cloth on it and put it in a vacuum bag. And I don't think I even autoclaved it. I think maybe later on I autoclaved it. It was a lot of cleanup, a lot of mess afterwards. You end up with this just huge goop of a head tube you got to cut down and make it look halfway pretty. And
Yeah.
that's what I did, is make my stuff look halfway pretty. Functionality was way over form, you know, and how pretty my bikes look. They always look pretty rough, but I didn't really care.
Um,
So that's how I made my head lug. And then I'd actually Bondo those aluminum mandrels to set my head tube angles.
okay.
And they were slightly tapered, so they would extract, they'd pull out of the part
hmm
because there's no draft on the item. You're never going to get that piece of aluminum out of there,
hmm
that head tube. And then, let's see, the top tube and down tube pulled out. And then the head tube had bearing races built into it. And it was split in the center, so you could take it apart and pull it out top and bottom.
Hmm.
So we were doing, I think eventually we used American Classic headset bearings, and we were just pressing them into the carbon after we went through only a couple of King Perdidos. And then other lugs, they were built on a flat plate in halves,
Uh-huh.
clamshelled, and then we glue them together like Calfee does. And
Oh,
we had a freestanding frame jig that we could walk all the way around. So we glue up hardtails or whatever we were making, or front end downhill bikes in this frame jig. So you could wipe all the lugs and sort of, you know, have access to all sides of the bicycle as you're gluing it.
I didn't know Calfee glued his lugs together.
Mm-hmm.
Learned something new.
I think bottom bracket and I mean, maybe he did it differently. Maybe he does it differently now, but I remember at one point he was doing it in halves.
Um, I think anytime you can truly see the mechanics and the build of a bike, that it has its own kind of beauty, you know?
Yeah,
One of the bikes I recently built was made by Patrick Morwood in South Africa, and it's all aluminum. And I'm like, I want it completely raw. He's like,
right.
well, what about a painted, linkage? I'm like, no, raw. Because
Raw.
like I love seeing the CNC machine marks.
Yeah,
I love knowing I could bash it off a tree, and if it scratches, I could hit it with an SOS pad. But to me, just seeing the mechanics of how something is built has its own kind of art sensibility to it. So I've always thought your bikes were cool looking, in as much as like that's how they're built.
yeah. And I like the prototypes, like we were talking with Specialized and Atherton have now, because that has that same like really crude, you know, look to it. That's, you can see everything about it, and nothing's really everything's exposed. I really like to have those bikes look.
Yeah, raw carbon, anytime you're building a raw carbon product, unless you're like a total fastidious perfectionist, everyone is going to be unique, right? So like on my Kestrel Rubicon, like it almost looked like wood grain just because you could see the wave of the UD, and like every bike's going to be just a little bit different.
Right. So your Rubicon was not painted?
No, even when you look at them closely, it's hard to tell, but you take them out in the sunlight and you can see the raw UD.
Yeah.
So,
And there's some, UV stuff that over long term starts to degrade layers, but there's so many layers in carbon stuff, and the carbon stuff we made, we never really worried about like doing a clear coat, like a UV clear coat on them or anything.
I was told they use a gel coat, so not like a standard paint, something much more durable, because that thing could take some hits and it didn't chip.
Yeah, that's good.
How many downhill bikes did BCD make?
I made to sell. I made one 2x4. I sold one 2x4. It's over in England somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And then I made one of the gearbox bikes that had the derailleur in the box, sort of like a Honda.
Oh, I thought you used like a Nexus hub.
I did a Nexus hub one, but I also did like shrunken chainstay and turned the derailleur vertically like Honda did. I made 3 of those bikes, I think, and one got stolen in Albuquerque. A friend of mine had, and then one is still in Indiana. This guy Josh Prater has it, who rode for our team of misfits and mashup dirtbag downhillers.
So around what year did you make the derailleur in a box, for lack of a better word?
I think that was more around 2003.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hondas would have come out in 04 or 05?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you were obviously racing all around this time.
Yeah.
What are some of your highlights of your race career that you look back on fondly?
Let's see. Well, the first suspension bike I took to Big Bear, the Cheeseburger, I really had a lot of fun on. And that was 93, I think I raced Big Bear on that. Maybe 4. And I've got a great picture. They'd send you those little photos stapled, after you got home, you get it in the mail and you have your race picture on it, little samples. And I've got a great picture of me racing that. It's really memorable to me. Like I'm in Lycra and I had long hair just like this. Then it looks like there's a freaking squirrel underneath my cross country helmet that I did. And I'm on my bike that I made and I was racing downhill. So that's a real memorable one. I don't remember what I got even, but
yeah. Were you racing pro all this time, or?
I sort of missed the window. Like as a junior, being the fastest American junior, I could have went pro the next year, like 92. And that sent a totally different trajectory probably to my racing. Probably wouldn't have made any bikes. I probably might have got sponsored or something. And been racing Jake Watson and all the guys that would have been racing during that time. And so, yeah, that I'm sort of glad that didn't happen. I took a few years off after junior and then started messing with building bikes. And I think I had a lot of fun, even though my racing career was a lot slower after that. Like we raced expert till Norbert came up with semi-pro category. I was right on the cusp of going from expert to pro that year. And then Norb was like, hey, we're doing a new category. Now we got to fill all these expert riders in the semi-pro category before you can go pro. So it was like 2 more years I raced semi-pro until I won some events and finally turned pro. I think that was maybe in like, it was 2x4 time. So yeah, probably early 2000, like 99 or 2000.
Yeah, I think I remember a picture of the 2x4 back in 1998, possibly with one of the early Manitou Expert carbons. Right? So I think that was around 98.
It didn't work great, but I really liked that fork. It was light and carbon and, yeah, I didn't have to make it.
I have one in my garage. I've never used it.
Oh, yeah.
It's just hanging there.
I tell you, you talk enough people in the bike industry, and sometimes it was hard to get stuff done because we were such little guys. But we did a lot of like OE pricing on stuff. So I barely made enough bikes to say we were a bike manufacturer.
Yeah.
But Answer Manitou always treated me well. Fox got me some stuff out pretty good. So that really helped the cost effectiveness of, trying to be a grassroots pro downhill racer.
So in my view, you have a lot of innovations that predate a lot of the companies that say they innovated things, right? Your 2x4 doesn't necessarily comply with the VPP pivot, but you certainly did something there that is virtual pivot point-ish, to the degree that you don't have a defined wheel path, which I don't know of any other manufacturer that can say we don't have a defined wheel path.
Yeah.
We have this window.
Later on, New Zealand bikes called Two Stage, they made sort of a copy of the 2x4.
Okay.
I think they're defunct now, but they made some production two-shock independent pivot location bikes that were pretty cool.
And then the Honda, what was their bike called? RM1?
Yeah.
Which basically was a whole drivetrain put in a small box. I didn't realize that you did that. I don't remember that one. Yeah. You did that a couple of years in advance of Honda.
I call that the coffin.
Okay.
And it sort of had this like massive like center section that was sort of encompassing all the derailleur and stuff. And that bike had own troubles. Also, the biggest one being is the drive chainring size off the crank was like 24 teeth or 28 later. And it went up to the derailleur in the frame before it went through a jack shaft to the rear wheel. But now you're pedaling at your cadence on a 28 tooth chainring, so the entire shifting mechanism shifts slower, like you're climbing a granny gear climb. So you're not moving on like a 3 or 4 to 1 ratio there. You're on like a 1 to 1 ratio. So the shifting never was like fast. It was really clunky.
It seems like cross chaining would be an issue when you have a shorter distance from drive to rear.
I don't know how many race runs I coasted down because I threw that chain off because too wide and narrow. Even with double chain guards, I'd throw off the BB sometimes and have to coast down because it was really acutely angled to go through. I think I had just like a 6 or 7 speed screw on freewheel cassette for the gear change because I was trying to keep it as narrow as possible. There's current designs now and that Shimano have like patent designs where it works on a slider and the chain goes up through the gears on both. I think the Honda, that main drive off the bottom bracket was on a spline slider, so it's tried to stay aligned with the rear shifting. So that was a bit of a flaw of that bike, but the whole design aspect of that bike was to reduce to change the sprung to unsprung weight ratio. Really lighten up that rear wheel, so you didn't have your cassette and your derailleur, all that stuff, moving up and down as much as it does on a downhill run. And the Nexus bike, that was its design too, was to coming from my dad listening to cars that he'd had Lotuses and things with inboard disc brakes.
Right.
That was very important, was the sprung weight ratio. So I sort of applied that to my downhill bike on those 2 bikes.
Yeah, so you had the Coffin, which was a compact drivetrain, and then you went to a Nexus. And is the Nexus the first bike that you had an idler?
So the Nexus was a jack shaft too.
Okay.
Like the pivot bikes they're racing on now, where they have like small sprocket up to 1 and then back again. And the Nexus was actually before the Coffin. It was in like 95, 96, somewhere in there. And I was actually Big Bear with my Nexus bike, all carbon, racing there. And some engineer from GT was up there at the race and saw my bike and just flipped shit. Like he couldn't believe that it was so similar to what they were working on and hadn't released yet. And then turned out they released that bike like 6 months later or so.
Yeah, the IT or whatever it was called, internal transmission, I think is what
It was like both our brain waves were doing the same thing. I was just
yeah.
in New Mexico and they were in California, and they had a budget and I had a garage. But I produced it and got it put out and was riding it and racing it before they released theirs. So I had some weird calls from GT talking to me about stuff. It's like they thought they had an internal mole or something, or it was pretty wild. It was fun.
Yeah. Yeah. With their, huge semi trucks and team of engineers and CNC machine shops.
Mm-hmm.
But, something I've kind of come to realize in having these conversations is it seems to be almost like there's a groundswell of common ideas happening all at once, that multiple people come up with, and then it kind of gels. And,
Yeah.
We were talking to Gary Fisher about the creation of the mountain bike. It was like there was a whole bunch of people doing similar things all at the same time.
Yeah.
And I don't know that anybody can say who actually invented the mountain bike, but it all happened around 1978 with people from all over,
Right. Yeah. The heyday of mountain bikes, in that 96 to 2000 era, it was just so big. There's so many people thinking about different things and wanting to do all this stuff. It was a great time to be involved in the evolution of downhill bikes from 1990 to 2000. I mean, it's just an enormous difference on those bicycles. It happened so quick.
That's what I think is fun about this little, kind of community, I guess I created was, that was the heyday. And we had people from all different backgrounds. I mean, Brent Foes was known for making off-road race trucks.
Right.
Mert Lawwell was making motorcycles.
Dave Turner.
What was Dave Turner doing before bikes, though? I mean, he was working for Horst Lichtner. And I guess Horst Lichtner had a motorcycle background.
Right.
Right.
I knew Dave pretty well at the races because my friend Scott Hart raced for Turner, and him and Josh are both from Indiana. Josh Prater, so we're always in that group of like me and Josh were sleeping in the vans at the parks. But Scott Hart was on Dave Turner's team, and he was in the condo up here, so we'd go crash the condo at Dave Turner's team and mooch on food and stuff.
Dave's a really good dude. I've owned a lot of Turner bikes, and I like to buy bikes from like companies that actually make their own stuff where you can call the dude, because a lot of times I'll do custom or whatever. So I've talked to Dave a lot over the years, and he's just always quick to pick up the phone and have a conversation. I mean, there have been times we've been on the phone for like an hour just chit chatting. He's just a good dude.
Yeah, you gotta have some personality and personable behavior to be in the bike industry. I mean, you end up talking to a lot of people. I would talk to a lot of races, and it was.
But yeah, the other one, Charlie Kernut, I guess he cut his teeth on motorcycle suspension, right? So that era, I guess the Kernut shock didn't come out till 2003, but Kernut was making shocks back into the 70s. Right?
Yeah.
Where they came out with the bicycle dedicated shock. So
what's your background on Reese Racing? Because I use their shock. A couple of things. Did they come from Moto or?
I don't know. But Reese was based in San Jose, so up here in the Bay Area. And I mean, back in the late 90s, I mean, there weren't too many companies you could call up and get something weird made. And so for like my Kestrel, I needed a 6-inch by 1 1/4 inch.
Right.
That wasn't off the shelf. So my options were Reese and maybe Stratos. I don't even know if they were around back then.
Right.
And Reese would make like almost anything. I mean, you can go to his website and he has sizes that are non-standard. But if you pick up the phone, like if he can make it work mechanically, he'll make it.
Right. Oh, I did. My bike had a Reese Terminator shock on it, and I needed a specific eye to eye and stroke and stuff. And yeah, he's like, "I'll make that. I can make that for you." So
yeah, and these days he'll work on almost anything. If you have a specialized brain shock or a Kernut shock, or he doesn't care. He'll figure it out. He'll make his own tools. If he has to make a tool, he'll just make the tool. So yeah, how did I get into, I mean, he was local and I can't think of any other options.
Were you racing in the 2000s?
Yeah. So I never got to your level. I mean, I did a couple like expert semi-pro races here and there, but I never got to your level.
Mammoth National.
Um, Pardon?
Mammoth National.
No, so I've done we had a local race series up here near San Jose in Hollister. That was a wintertime race series, which was neat because there aren't too many wintertime downhill race series, but the soil up there was gravelly enough that you could ride it, you know, the day following a rain. So like Mark Weir and Marla Streb,
Yeah.
the whole Santa Cruz team, that was about 1998. And then Reese would show up, and Reese, if you remember the Remix, they had a carbon front end with a Reese Lassen rear end.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just luckily, I grew up in the Bay Area. I mean, there's everybody. I mean, Rock Shock, Reese, Santa Cruz, Specialized. So even in my local race series, Ventana, you would go there and you would see some stuff.
Yeah.
And so I was doing that downhill race series on my Kestrel Rubicon that I had built up. I had a first gen Monster T with Gazolottis, the Alps 5, Reese in the back, and then I had broken like 6 or 7 of those Kestrels.
Yeah.
And so Kestrel's here local. And I kept begging them to make me a heavy one. And the engineers, Preston Sandusky, I believe his name is. The engineers thought they could outsmart, the rider, and they're like, "No, we don't need to make it heavier." And after the 6th or 7th one, like, okay, so they built me like an extra heavy duty layup. They made all the pivots out of steel instead of aluminum. They made me a disc brake mount finally.
Cool.
And it was a beast of a bike. I mean, 8 3/4 inches of travel and back and 7 in the front.
Yeah.
It was gnarly.
Cool.
But I was racing cross country at the time also.
Yeah.
And I was working for a local bike shop. We were a GT Giant Mongoose dealer, and I got onto the iDrives, and I just love the iDrives.
Right.
But I broke 15 of them because that monocoque seat mast was just totally underbuilt.
Right.
And I'm tall. I'm 6'3", and I'm running like this much seat post, So I broke 15 of those, and then GT started making me custom versions of that. So I had like the Ruckus before the Ruckus came out. And then I don't know if you've ever have you ever done Downeyville in Northern California?
No, Downeyville.
So Downeyville, like the Downeyville, pardon?
I know all about it. It's length and
dude, it's brutal. It's like 17 miles, 5,000 feet of descent over boulder fields.
Right.
I mean, that's probably the hardest race I've ever done. I remember completing the Downeyville downhill and like just falling off my bike. But that's probably my best finish ever. I was racing expert. And what's funny back then is, in expert class, I got 10th or 11th place, but I would have gotten 6th if I raced pro.
Yeah.
Because
we'd always do that comparison,
Yeah. Like, why didn't I sign up as pro?
And we always said you got to be on the first sheet of the qualifying list in pro.
Yeah.
So if you're racing, you got to be on the first page.
So I was just a local racer, but I mean, obviously you can tell I'm just a bike geek. Like I've raced road, I've raced cross country, I've raced downhill, I've raced whatever Downeyville is. I don't know what you call that.
Right.
So yeah.
Early enduro.
Pardon?
Early enduro, single stage.
Yeah, Dave Turner said he built the 5 spot specifically for Downeyville because it was like you needed a good amount of travel and it had the pedal.
Yeah, right.
So okay, your 2x4, your coffin. Tell me about the creation and inception of the 29er. I mean, you were building a 29er carbon fiber downhill bike before most people thought 29ers were even like viable for cross country.
Yeah, well, they were just on the edge of cross country viable.
Yeah,
given rim widths and tires that you were able to use and stuff. But the bike I used for a 29er was actually the Inedible. which after all the complicated bikes I made and I travel to races and have issues and not be able to race, and they were as cool as those were, I wanted like a simple bike that would be super reliable and I could race, day in and day out. And that was the Innovating, which was just a high pivot with a pulley, all carbon and light.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I made about 4 of those too,
Mm-hmm.
5 of those, and had a small team when I had those bikes put out. And Sanjay Sandbag
Uh-huh.
was on my team. I gave him a bike, and it was me, Sanjay, and this guy Seth Harney,
Mm-hmm.
who is really good at ultra endurance stuff now. He grew up in Amarillo with me, and at the time he was just a junior, and we were traveling around to races and stuff. But that bike is what I used from here on out. I still use it if I go up to Angel Fire. That was sort of the last bike I made, and I wanted to use it with some 29-inch wheels because I was working at a shop at the time in Amarillo when Specialized came out with their first production Rockhopper 29er, and I bought that bike, and I was like, wow, there's so much traction, and so little like bump impact and stuff, all these like great advantages to this wheel size. So when I first started like thinking about how to do it, I wanted to increase the spoke angle because the wheel's taller, so I wanted to bring the flanges out. So on my Innovatables and some of my previous bikes, actually, I started using like custom 6 and 7 speed cassettes with like individual cogs and Shimano spacers on a single speed hub body. And there's a hub company called Razor Rock out of Colorado. They made me a custom hub body that for some of my downhill wheels. It was like 160 by 20 mil through axle with a hub body or a cassette body big enough for like 6 or 7 cogs. So I was doing that too, really early on before like all downhill bikes are now. They're all 7 speed shifting. But that gave me the wide flanges for the 29-inch wheels. And then I used, take that. The Razor Rock was early on, like 2x4 era. But for the 29er, I wanted stiffer wheels. So I got a single speed Industry 9 29 wheel set. I think the first wheel set I used. And their spokes are a lot stiffer. So I felt like.
What was the rim on that?
I think I was using one of them. I was using Chris Holm unicycle rims.
Right.
He was doing 29-inch wheels on a unicycle and rolled, had a wider extrusion than you could get. Other than that, it was like, a WTB rim at maybe 28 or something. I think these were close to 36, these Chris Holmes. So that gave me a little more air volume, but I was still faced with running single wall, cross-country tires.
Yep.
And so I took cross-country tire and cut all the tread off. So all I had was the bead and a ply of inner wire. So just that inside my cross-country tires that I was running to sort of give me a double ply tire. And that worked pretty well. It's all pre-tubeless stuff, But that's what I used when I raced for the first time on it at the Mont Saint Anne World Cup. I had 29-inch wheels, and you might correct me. I think it was 2007.
I think it was 2007.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was really worried because they specified your wheels can't be bigger than 29 inches, the UCI. And I was worried that I would get like, the cyclocross tire check, or they'd be up there with a tape measure, but they barely even, I don't think they even noticed, but a lot of my friends did, because the bike looks so strange then, because now it looks strange if you see something with a, 650 on the back, you're like, whoa, but if you go in from, 26 to 29 or there were some 27.5s at that point, but there were still people riding 26s. It looked really drastic.
People definitely noticed because there were threads on, is it Ride Monkey? What's that forum?
I was big on Ride Monkey for decades.
And people were tracking the progress of the bike, like he finally did it. Like people, because you were the first.
Yeah,
So,
it
I mean,
hurt, man. I would race up at Angel Fire on it, I remember, and I'd come through a rock garden and people just like jaw dropped because you just didn't have to slow down like you did with a smaller wheel diameter. I'd come pinging through the top of stuff, and they're like, "You're gonna win this weekend, man! I cannot believe how fast you went through that rock garden." And I didn't at all, but it if you look from trackside, it just looks like way wild, different.
and was that the bike with the White Brothers inverted fork?
Yep, and it had wider spacing too. White Brothers, I think, was 120, and then you had to use a little spacer to make it 140 and like offset the wheel. So somehow I like took that spacer out, and like redished my wheel so I could have more triangulation on my front wheel too, and then I could slide the legs up and down. So I got a bigger diameter wheel, and I reduced the travel, I think, from 7 to 6.
Mm-hmm.
Mindset at that point, I was like, you don't need this much travel because I got the wheel size. So I think I was running 5.5 in the back and 6 in the front.
Mm-hmm.
An edible 29 downhill bike.
Mm-hmm.
And you start buzzing your ass more and stuff. So you're like, man, there's a lot of tire back there. And if I had 8 inches on that, I'd really have some serious frame clearances. As is, I was still like buzzing the rear tire on the C tube on full compression. So there's a lot, and currently on 29er guys that run front and rear, like Minar and stuff, they take a lot of room, on an 8-inch, 29-inch travel or an 8-inch travel 29 wheel bike. It's like there's a lot of space you got to have available in there for these wheels to move, including your butt.
And they're still buzzing tires.
Yeah, always coming down with black butts.
Yep. Do you have any recollection of what the geometry on that bike was like?
So initially it was probably like 66 head when I was running 27.5s.
Mm-hmm.
I actually cut the head tube off and made a new head tube and glued it on to bring it down to like 65, I think, or 64.5. The wheelbase was incredibly short, though. I liked running short chainstays.
Mm-hmm.
My chainstays started at like 16.25.
Oh, wow.
At full compression with a high pivot, ended up like 17.5 or 17.75.
Mm-hmm.
So I always ran really short chainstays. And now bikes are so long, like a full downhill bike. I don't know how I could handle a bike like that. I've never even ridden a modern downhill bike. So
They are so much longer now.
yeah, they're so long.
I mean, the wheelbases are 6-7 inches longer than they were back in the day.
Yeah.
And 63-degree head tubes seem to be sort of the norm right now. But if you were 64.5 back in like 2007, I'd have to look, but I think that would be pretty progressive as well.
I was pushing what I thought was structurally safe on my carbon fiber head tube and down tube, even at 3/16 wall thicknesses. I was like, don't want.
So you think Balfa was the first to run the high pivot with an idler?
I think so, and I think I was unaware of it. Like they were a small local frame manufacturer, and I hadn't seen a picture of it at the time when I made mine.
Mm-hmm.
But again, 2 people working on the same sort of ideas. And I think some of the early bikes were jack shaft before the BB7. I think they did an jack shaft. They probably, I did that with my Nexus, and our 2 minds were going, hey, I really need a jack shaft. All I got to do is just take this up over a pulley.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's what both of us ended up doing. And
I'm actually really surprised that Dave Weigel did the jack shaft on the pivot bike. You would think with the high pivot with an idler, you could achieve the same thing, but maybe not.
You can, and he might correct me on this, but I think ground clearance was what they really were pushing more towards. With a jack shaft bike, you can run a smaller chainring.
Oh.
And you have less problems of, bottoming out and smashing something.
Yeah. Okay, I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah. And the Cannondale, they made with all the jack shaft chains. So they had 3 of them, and they could change the ratio on the first 2 for their overall gear ratio without being the relationship to the chain that went to the rear wheel and the pivot. So that was like a whole nother deal Cannondale was working on. And I always hear or think about Miles having issues with that, and rocks hitting the chains and breaking him at World Cups and costing him all kinds of possible victories because he was having to ride like crazy prototype stuff like I was doing. But Cannondale was feeding it to him, and he probably just wanted a simple old bike, and they were making him ride these things. And I remember hearing articles and reading about it, hearing people talk how frustrated it was to like ride these crazy bikes that, it worked good most of the time, but if they didn't, they might cost you a victory.
Cannondale was doing cool stuff back then. I've heard that particular bike, the name escapes me. I've heard it was a pig. But also one of the main dudes at Cannondale back at that time said that suspension system from a kinematics perspective predated the VPP.
Yeah, because it had 2 links.
Yeah, and so like the VPP patent talks about like counter-rotating links and the S-shaped axle path. Those were the first 2 patents.
Right.
When Rob Roscott got a hold of it, the third patent was a single-piece swing arm because the original Outland had a more of, I don't want to say horse link, but a multi-piece swing arm.
Right.
So this dude that I know that was prominent at Cannondale back in the day said basically they could have sued against the VPP patent, but they just didn't care to because they had already moved past it. And this is the kind of history that I learn as I go. That it was like I really try to bring that stuff to light. But I don't have any. I don't have any documentation. Just word of mouth.
That Outland. I haven't heard about that, but I can see the print ad of that in my mind.
Yeah, I recently got my hands on an Outland. A buddy of mine was just cleaning out his garage. He was like, "Here you go," and he gave me like a pristine Outland, and I'm like, "I have too many bikes already." So I donated it to the Marin Mountain Bike Hall of Fame.
Oh, cool.
Because they don't have one, and they have one of Greg Menard's carbon V10s. And I went out there again, just living in the Bay Area. I used to work at Wilderness Trail Bikes. So I know a lot of the old dudes, Joe Breeze and Gary Fisher and Charlie Kelly and Charlie Cunningham and blah, blah, blah. So I just happened to know that the Mountain Bike Hall of Fame didn't have an Outland. And I took my daughter out there one day with this bike, and Joe Breeze, who's just, if you haven't met him, just the nicest guy in the world and one of the most knowledgeable people about cycling in general, not just mountain biking. I went out there with my Outland and then also with my Cross Track because I knew he didn't have one of those.
Yeah.
I said, I have this bike that you might be interested in. Would you want it? And he's like, what is it? I'm like, it's an Outland. He was like, what's that?
Right.
I pull it out of my car. He's like, so what's special about this? I'm like, well, this is the original VPP. Like that Greg Menard bike all started with this. And I told him like the history. He's like, oh. And so now my Outland is right in front of Greg Menard's bike in the Mountain Bike Hall of Fame.
Cool. That's a great place for it because that was a very interesting bike. I always liked it. I think it's
the progression.
It probably stirred my mind on the 2x4. What are they trying to do here with these axle paths? And then that's sort of what got my 2x4 mind probably going.
Yeah.
Like, why have an axle path?
Yeah, I mean, so many back in the day didn't think so much about that, right? At least not in detail.
Or too much about it, maybe.
Yeah. I saw somebody trying to compare your Inedible to that original Trek full suspension bike, like the 9300 or whatever.
Oh, right.
Somebody is like, well, there's 2 things to consider. It has an actual damper, and have you noticed how the chain is routed?
Night and day, because how my first 2x4 felt was that Cannondale.
Yeah. I think we've talked about many of your innovations. I don't know if we've missed anything of particular import.
No, I never broke a bike like head tube sheared off or anything. I was always really proud of that. I always built my stuff so strong that maybe I'd crack a swing arm, and have to replace one. But I never had a bike like completely fail on me in half. So that's probably why I'm not paraplegic today.
And you did it at home, self-taught, building carbon fiber everything, literally out of a Kenmore oven?
Yeah.
There was a rumor somebody posted the other day that you had built carbon fiber rotors.
I did, yeah. I made some pre-preg plate and cut it out into a rotor and threw it on my bike with some red EBC organic pads.
Mm-hmm.
Last about one weekend.
Mm-hmm.
I actually had one shear on me and go from a 210 to like a 75 millimeter rotor in the middle of a run. I think I was at Vermont National, and
Uh-huh.
just just like came apart in a million pieces, and I had to put a steel rotor back on at that point. But yeah, they're light, but the surface hardness isn't there, and I
Yeah.
think you could do it now with carbon. I don't know whether it would ever heat up enough, to like have a good brake feel. Um,
Mhm.
I saw guys at the World Cup this year. They were running some covers at rainy races to sort of make more reliable front brake feel, and it looked all MotoGP on their downhill bikes.
Yeah.
Loic was riding one, I think.
I forget. It's not Andouille, but it kind of. What was the name of that race course?
Oh, I forget which one it was at. It was at the French one last couple of weekends ago.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember seeing those. Beyond frames, brake rotors, seat posts, what else did BCD make for your own personal use or for sale?
Trying to think. Carbon wise, not much. I mean, I've always just sort of tinkered with making stuff. That's my dad instilled that in me, that you can fix anything pretty much. So I fix my cars, I do my housework, and why pay somebody to do it if you can do it? Build my own computer, and it's always sort of been instilled in me from my dad's entrepreneurialism.
With this kind of hobby that I'm involved in with vintage downhill bikes, so many, because we've got members from all around the world trying to build their dream bikes from back in the day, but not everything is available, right?
Yeah.
So I really encourage that. Last year I had a Foes Mono 2-to-1, which was the one with the 10-inch
Yeah.
long shock.
Right.
And an XTD fork. I happened to get my hands on a prototype, which was really neat because the machining is different and the anodization is different.
Yeah.
But the hard part to find about those forks, servicing them is difficult, but there's like 3 or 4 companies I know of that'll work on them. It's an inverted fork, and the fork guards are just not available.
Right.
And like I told you, I keep UD prepreg in my freezer. And my friend, remember Judd that I mentioned that was building Alpha Q forks that went into aerospace.
Yeah.
He built back in 2005 3 sets of carbon fiber fork guards for the Foes XTD fork, and I just called him up. I'm like, how'd you do this? Sure enough, it's just a galvanized plumbing pipe with some steel metal and some band clamps and release agent, and I got a pair of these. He built 3 sets. My friend Rolf has one, Chris at Foes has one, and Judd has one. So I got a set from Rolf, and I just kind of drew, a cutout. And it took me 2 tries. I had to get the layup right. The first one was too flexy. The second one was what I needed, and I was able to shape it with my Dremel tool. I did it myself, and you can't get these anywhere. And I had people offering me like $400 a set. I'm like, no,
right,
not going into production. But I guess my point is if we're involved in vintage bikes, you're not really going to hurt anything by trying. At least not with a fork guard. It's not structural, and I think you kind of epitomized that, but. People need to have a basic mechanical understanding and be willing to, jump off and play a little bit with composites. I mean, it is rocket science, but it's not, right?
No, it's really not. And I did it because I couldn't afford downhill bikes, It's like, go racing, I have X amount of money to spend on the travel and entry and everything, but the bike isn't included in that. So I was like, I'm going to build my bikes, and that's how I sort of got into building bikes, is financially.
What are you doing today?
Today I went and cut down some standing dead trees, and I'm way behind on my firewood. But that's what I did today.
you live like, are you even in a town in New Mexico?
They call it a hamlet because it has a church and a post office.
Uh-huh.
That's its designation. But there's probably 150 people within, I don't know, 40 miles circumference of me.
Wow.
It's a very rural area in northern New Mexico
Mm-hmm.
that I've been through for almost 20 years, and always saw this one adobe, which is mud brick house built pre 1900, and it was really large, had tall ceilings. And my father had built adobes in Santa Fe in the 80s, and he always talked about how great they were with their thermal mass, and they maintain heat and cool, and they're just great to live in. So I wanted to live in an adobe. So I went somewhere where they have a lot of old adobes, which is northern New Mexico,
Yeah.
and I got this one on an acre for $35,000,
Wow.
and it's about 900 square feet. It was the first schoolhouse in the valley. Pre 1900. There's no concrete in it. It's all just like rough cut timber, dug for floors, and 10-foot ceilings with beadboard. Um, yeah, this wall here is just raw. We haven't done a full finish on it yet, but where's the yeah? See, it's just straight mud.
How would
But
you even
the
how would
ceilings
you
are
even finish that?
beadboard. Huh?
How would you even finish that?
Lime plaster is like the best way to like make it really pretty, but you can just take that and like wet it, and on the exterior of the adobe, we actually just rehash the mud that's like melted onto the ground and sift it, and then just put it right back up on the wall, because we like to do natural plasters instead of stucco or anything, because you want a great part of the adobe is it breathes, like the humidity levels, are maintained uh, better that way. You'll if you do like a stucco, you'll trap a vapor barrier and cause erosion to the adobe. So
Mm.
you want the building to sort of breathe through the different climates of the year.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I found this really great house in this really pretty area where the plains meet the mountains.
Mm-hmm.
And if anybody hadn't seen it, well, I was on the Shimano gravel cycling team for a few years, and they came here and shot a video. It's up on YouTube. If you just Google my name and Shimano, and they did a really cool video
What
that
was the
showed.
name of that? What was the name of that video?
Uh, let's see. It's This Is Home. I think it's one of the Shimano like this. I think it's called This Is Home. But if you just do Alex Morgan and Shimano, you'll see it, and that it sort of shows highlights where I live and what I'm doing here. Me and my wife have been here 6 years now, and she has sort of a rare goat herd of Valaeus blackneck goats.
Mm-hmm.
She took over the breeding of an elderly man who had a Swiss wife in Colorado, and they imported semen and bred with alpine goats to get this breed for the first time in America.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the only intact buck in all the U.S. here in Ocate, and we do breeding. We kid every spring to sort of keep the breed going here in America. So that's been fun.
So you went from gravity racing to goat herding.
Goat herding. I'm on the volunteer fire department,
Uh-huh.
and I've been on a lot of fires, small ones, and I'm probably going to start to retire from that, because it's it's good to do for a while, but you sort of serve your term, and I don't want to be in fireproof clothing and inhaling too much smoke
Yeah.
at my age. I'm at 52 now this summer, so um, you
I
start to think
will
about.
I will find that Shimano video on YouTube and post it in the comments so anybody can see it, because it was a really well done video.
Yeah.
And it shows a lot of your location. I think you have a farmer neighbor who's a bit of a character.
Yes,
Um, uh,
Bob.
yeah, and it shows some of your creations.
It does.
Um, yeah, your red, white, and blue and edible. I think it is.
Yeah, yeah, I got crazy with the rattle can on that.
Yeah,
I think I've gone through like 3 paint jobs on that bike. I
yeah,
just show up with some other color. Why not?
yeah. Well, Alex, I really appreciate you and people like you. I think more people need to kind of have the guts and the initiative to take on things that maybe they feel they're not capable of. You know, the old adage, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, is a great way to solve problems, right?
Yeah.
And you can take on almost anything if you just take a big problem and turn it into bite-sized chunks and take one step at a time.
Yeah. It does
Um,
all the time.
I've done that a little bit myself. But people like you have taken it to the extreme and built bikes and innovated well in advance of huge race teams with engineers and big budgets. And for many of the innovations that downhill bikes have seen in the last 20 years, it seems like you were at least a few years ahead of everybody, which is pretty wild.
Thank you.
So I told you before we started recording, it's not my intent to make you blush, but if I do, that's okay.
I'm glad there's people out there that appreciate all my paper sketches and failed attempts and positive attempts.
No, it's really cool what you've done. And so my goal is just to share, history about people and technologies and racing and everything, especially about people and technologies that not everybody knows about. So give me a few days. We'll get this edited and posted everywhere, and people, I'm sure, will really enjoy it.
I hope so. Yeah. It's funny to see every now and then, something pops up on a forum that, there's two people in there, that know what's going on. And everybody else is totally clueless or oblivious to what is trying to happen with the bicycles I made. So those are fun. I'll end up getting tagged in it and I'll chime in when I can.
Yeah. I appreciate when you participate in the group, but if not, people always like when I post up some of your creations. They're always blown away.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's all I had for you today. Unless you have anything else, I think we'll call this one done.
Yeah, that's a really fun part of my life that I really enjoyed living and experiencing as we.
Right on. All right, I'm going to hit the stop record button here. Thanks a lot, Alex.
Sure. Talk to you later.